Every case on this show gets the same treatment before we ever sit down to record. Full timeline, every piece of physical evidence, every post-case development run down to the source.
If you want to check our work, and you should, the full source list for this episode is sitting right there in the episode notes.
I'm Eli Marchetti.
And Simone Valdez. This is Precision and Instinct.
Sundown, June 19th, 1953, Ossining, New York. A prison called Sing Sing.
A husband and wife are walked separately into a room with one chair. Wood, leather straps, a metal cap.
He goes first. 3 jolts, 2,000 volts each.
Then her. And here's the part that still turns my stomach. It takes 5.
Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, the only American civilians ever executed for espionage in peacetime, convicted of handing the Soviet Union the design for the atomic bomb.
Except, that's not quite what the evidence says. Not against both of them, anyway.
I'm Eli Marchetti.
I'm Simone Valdez. This is Precision and Instinct.
Let's build the people before we build the case. Julius Rosenberg, born 1918, Lower East Side, electrical engineering degree from City College. Ethel, born Ethel Greenglass, 1915, wanted to sing on Broadway, ended up a secretary and a labor organizer instead.
They meet at a Young Communist League event, married in 39. 2 boys, Michael and Robert. On paper, it's a Bronx apartment, a union card, and a couple who genuinely believed the Soviet Union was the future.
That belief is not in dispute. What's in dispute is what they did about it.
Here's my instinct read before we even open the file. Everything about how this case gets prosecuted later, the 2 Jewish immigrant kids from the Lower East Side, the crime of the century language, that's not incidental. That's the atmosphere the whole thing breathes in.
Fair, but let's be precise about that atmosphere. Because it's easy to hear communist in 1940s New York and picture something fringe. It wasn't. Nationally, the Communist Party USA topped out around 75 to 100,000 members, out of a country of over 130 million, a rounding error.
But numbers lie if you zoom out too far. Zoom into the actual rooms Julius and Ethel lived in. Lower East Side, working class, Jewish, labor movement New York. And that party card isn't exotic. It's practically neighborhood furniture.
This is the Depression, 25% unemployment, bread lines around the block. Capitalism looks, to a lot of people, like it just visibly failed. Soviet propaganda is selling full employment and a planned economy, and for a generation that watched the system they grew up in collapse, that's not naive. It reads like the rational bet.
And it's not just economics. By the mid to late 30s, the party's rebranding itself as the loudest anti-fascist voice in the country, ahead of the mainstream parties, ahead of most of Washington. For Jewish families who'd fled pogroms in Europe, watching Hitler rise while their own government dragged its feet, that pulls people in who never opened a page of Marx. They're there for the anti-fascism.
So this is the world Julius and Ethel meet in, a Young Communist League event, a few years before they marry. Not radicals in a vacuum. 2 kids from a very specific, very real corner of American life, where this was simply what a politically engaged young Jewish New Yorker looked like.
That sympathy doesn't hold forever, for what it's worth. Stalin signs a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939, and membership craters. People quit in disgust overnight. It creeps back up once the USSR becomes a wartime ally against the Nazis. Then it's gone for good once the Cold War sets in, and Khrushchev's own revelations about Stalin's purges come out.
Which matters for where we're headed, because the country that executes the Rosenbergs in 1953 is not the country they joined the party in. By the time Julius and Ethel are on trial, that entire political current, mainstream and almost unremarkable in 1936, has been redefined as treasonous by default. Same beliefs, completely different verdict on holding them.
That's the atmosphere. Now, Precision wants the paper trail. And the paper trail starts with a man named Klaus Fuchs.
Fuchs is a German-born physicist working on the actual Manhattan Project at Los Alamos. British intelligence catches him in early 1950. He's been passing atomic secrets to Moscow for years. Under interrogation, he gives up his American courier.
A chemist named Harry Gold.
Gold gives up the next link, a Los Alamos army machinist who'd been passing him sketches of the bomb's lens mold implosion mechanism.
David Greenglass, Ethel's little brother.
Greenglass is arrested in June 1950, and within weeks, he's naming the man who recruited him in the first place, his brother-in-law,
Julius.
The FBI arrests Julius on July 17, 1950. Ethel, despite there being no comparable chain leading to her, is arrested 3 weeks later on August 11th.
And that gap matters. That's not evidence catching up to her. That's a decision.
Let's talk physical evidence, because there's genuinely a piece of pop culture famous evidence here, and it's smaller than people remember.
The Jell-O box.
Gold needed a way to identify himself to Greenglass as Julius's courier, so Julius cuts the side panel off a box of Jell-O into a jagged shape, gives half to Greenglass, keeps the matching half. When Gold shows up in Albuquerque and the two torn edges fit together like a puzzle piece, Greenglass knows he's legitimate.
It's almost absurdly simple. A grocery store box as a spy credential.
But it's also exactly the kind of tradecraft detail that's hard to fabricate. Both Greenglasses testified to it independently, and it lines up with Gold's own account.
Sure, but notice what that evidence actually proves. It proves Julius ran a courier drop. It says nothing about Ethel. The box was in his hand by his sister-in-law Ruth's own testimony.
Which brings us to the testimony that actually convicted her. At trial, David Greenglass takes the stand and says that in September 1945, he watched his sister Ethel sit at a portable typewriter in the Rosenbergs' apartment and type up his handwritten notes on the atomic bomb, notes meant for the Soviets.
That's it. That's the single piece of testimony that turns Julius's wife, who may have known things, into co-conspirator facing the chair.
The prosecutor, in his summation, all but says it outright. The typewriter is what makes her an active participant instead of a bystander.
Now here's where my gut starts screaming, and I want you to sit with the timeline. David and his wife Ruth had been the government's key witnesses since the day of their arrest. But according to FBI records, neither of them mentioned Ethel typing anything, not once, until 10 days before trial.
10 days.
10 days before trial, David Greenglass suddenly remembers his sister at a typewriter, 5 years after the fact. And Ruth Greenglass, who actually faced no charges at all, corroborates it on the stand.
I'll give you that the timing is suspicious on its face, but suspicious timing isn't the same as false testimony. People do recover memories closer to a trial when they're finally asked the right question.
Except we don't have to guess anymore, Eli. In 2001, David Greenglass told New York Times reporter Sam Roberts on the record that he lied. He said he never actually saw Ethel typing anything. He only knew about it secondhand from Ruth. He said he testified against his own sister to keep Ruth out of prison, so she could stay home and raise their kids.
Without that testimony, I believe she would not have been convicted, let alone executed. That's Roberts' own assessment, and it's hard to argue with. The typewriter was the smoking gun, and the man holding it now says the gun was empty.
He buried his sister and lived another 60 years under an assumed name in Queens, trying not to be found.
Precision has to be honest about the other side of this, because it cuts hard against easy sympathy. In 1995, the NSA finally declassified the VENONA project, decrypted World War II-era Soviet cable traffic, sitting classified for 50 years.
And Julius is all over it.
Under the codename Liberal, one cable has Soviet intelligence worrying about overworking him. That's how productive a source he was. Combined with co-defendant Morton Sobel's own 2008 confession that he and Julius had been passing military secrets for years, there is no serious historical argument left that Julius Rosenberg was innocent.
I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Even his own sons, who spent decades insisting on their father's innocence, came out after Sobel's confession and said, in their words, they had no reason to doubt it.
That's Michael and Robert, two boys, 10 and 6 years old when their parents were arrested.
We're going to come back to them, but finish the cable story first, because this is where precision and instinct actually agree, and it's rare.
Ethel appears in exactly one VENONA message, not as an agent, as a wife. The cable describes her as politically sympathetic, in poor health, aware of her husband's work. It does not assign her a code name. She never transmitted anything. By the government's own intercepted communications, she was not treated as an operative.
A declassified 2025 memo, one attributed to the NSA's own lead VENONA decryptor, put it about as plainly as a government document ever puts anything. Ethel was not a spy.
So why prosecute her at all if the case was this thin?
Here's my read, and it's not really speculation at this point. It's what the prosecutors said themselves at the time. Ethel was leverage. The government's real target was breaking Julius, getting him to name the rest of the ring. The threat of executing his wife was the pressure they thought would make him talk.
He never did.
He never did. And instead of backing off, they carried the leverage all the way through to the chair. Because backing off at that point would have meant admitting the leverage was empty.
And here's what turns the leverage theory from instinct into paper trail. It wasn't just outside critics who thought executing her went too far. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, the man running the entire investigation, recommended against it. A memo drafted for him argued no purpose would be served by a death sentence for Ethel. Hoover wanted 30 years for her, with Julius's sentence tied to whether he cooperated.
And when Judge Kaufman formally consulted the prosecution team after the guilty verdict, asking whether both Rosenberg should get the same sentence, that team, as a body, was reluctant to back her execution too.
So the two institutions that actually built this case, the FBI that investigated it, and the prosecutors who tried it, both leaned toward sparing her life. Kaufman had that on the record, and he sentenced her to death anyway.
Which makes what happened next even harder to defend. Because the official team being reluctant didn't mean nobody was pushing the other way.
I want to name the judge because precision doesn't get to skip the parts of the system that failed here. Irving Kaufman presided. Decades later, FBI memos, released after a Freedom of Information request filed by the Rosenbergs' own sons, showed Kaufman had been in private, one-sided contact with one member of that prosecution team before sentencing, a 23-year-old assistant named Roy Cohn, who broke ranks with his own office's reluctance and personally lobbied the judge for death, for Ethel specifically. That's a serious breach of judicial ethics, confirmed by the paper record, not rumor.
One ambitious young man, going around the very team he worked for, is what closed the gap between the government leaned toward mercy and the government killed her. That's this whole case in a single fact. And this trial makes his career. He goes on to be Joseph McCarthy's chief counsel. Later in life, he mentors a young real estate developer in New York on how to fight in public and never apologize.
We're not going to say the name. You already know it.
We don't have to connect that dot for you. It's just a fact sitting there in the historical record, waiting for whoever wants to pick it up.
Let's stay with Cohn for a minute, because Precision thinks his backstory actually explains the climate this whole case happened in, not just one man's opportunism.
My instinct's been itching to get here since we said his name the first time. Roy Cohn is one of the strangest, most self-contradictory figures to walk through 20th century American power.
Born 1927, Bronx, into money and legal pedigree, his father was a judge. Family lore has it his own parents' marriage was practically a business transaction. His mother's wealthy family bankrolled his father's judgeship in exchange for the wedding. Cohn is raised from birth in a household where ambition and transaction are the same language.
He's a prodigy on paper, Columbia Law School at 20. But everyone who worked with him says the same thing. It was never really about the law. It was about winning and being feared while doing it.
The Rosenberg trial is his first major national stage at 23 years old. And by his own later boasting, he didn't just prosecute. He claimed he privately engineered which judge got the case and then lobbied that judge toward a death sentence.
That's not tough young lawyer having a big case. That's a 23-year-old deciding two people should die and then working the machinery until they did.
From there, he goes straight to Joseph McCarthy's committee as chief counsel. 18 months at the absolute center of the anti-communist hearings. Same playbook. Destroy first, ask questions never.
Here's where the self-loathing thread comes in. And it's not speculation, it's documented. While Cohn is helping drive the hunt for communists in government, that same McCarthy-era machinery is running a parallel purge. Historians call it the Lavender Scare, hunting gay men and women out of federal jobs as supposed security risks.
Cohn himself was gay, closeted his entire public life, seen for years at Studio 54 with young male companions, and denying it to every reporter who asked, right up to his death.
A man helping fuel a persecution machine built, in part, to destroy people like himself. That's not a footnote. That's the psychological engine of the whole era. Paranoia doesn't just point outward. It eats the people running it too.
He spends the following decades representing mob bosses, shipping magnates, Studio 54's owners, always ambitious, always operating right at the edge of the law, indicted 3 separate times for bribery, perjury, mail fraud, obstruction, extortion, never convicted, not once.
Until, finally, in 1986, 6 weeks before his death, a disciplinary panel disbars him for stealing money from a client and a string of other conduct they called particularly reprehensible. His response, reportedly, was to call the judges a bunch of yo-yos.
He was dying of AIDS at the time. He told the press it was liver cancer, all the way to the end.
And the people he'd spent decades collecting as friends and protégés, including the man he'd mentored in real estate and public combat starting in the 1970s, mostly disappeared once he couldn't do anything for them anymore.
There's one more detail here precision thinks earns its place. Decades later, a documentary examines Cohn's entire life. The Rosenberg trial, McCarthy, the mob clients, the closeted double life, all of it.
It's directed by Ivy Meeropol,
Julius and Ethel's own granddaughter, making a film about the man who helped put her grandparents in the chair.
A boy who prosecuted a case partly built on outsider suspicion. 2 Jewish radicals, a wife used as leverage, grows up to spend his whole career hiding an outsider identity of his own, while helping a system punish people for exactly that kind of difference.
We're not drawing a moral here. We're just telling you who was standing in the room. Appeals run for 2 years. The case becomes an international story. Protests in over 40 countries. Pope Pius XII appeals for mercy. Albert Einstein appeals for mercy. Even people who accepted the couple's guilt questioned whether death was a proportionate sentence for conspiracy, not treason, not espionage itself, but conspiracy to commit it.
Eisenhower denies clemency twice. His stated reasoning is that their actions immeasurably increased the chances of atomic war.
On the evening of June 19, 1953, timed notably to happen before sundown brought in the Jewish Sabbath, Julius is executed first. Witnesses describe him going with what one reporter called a grotesque smile.
Then Ethel. And here's the detail I can't get past. Gut or evidence, doesn't matter which lens you use. The executioner sends 3 shocks through Julius and he's gone. Ethel takes 4, and she's still alive. They send a 5th.
Smoke was reported rising from her head.
The woman the government's own intercepted cables never gave a code name to needed 5 jolts of 2,000 volts to die.
Michael was 10. Robert was 6. That afternoon, they'd been in the death house for a final visit with their parents.
What happened to them next doesn't get told nearly enough, and it should. No relative would take them in publicly. The family was too radioactive in every sense. They were shunted between a shelter, family friends, even pushed out of a New Jersey public school because of who they were.
Their parents' defense attorney, Emanuel Bloch, eventually found them a home with a Bronx schoolteacher named Abel Meeropol and his wife, Anne.
But before that home was found, it was Bloch himself who stepped in. He delivered the eulogy at Julius and Ethel's funeral and served as the boys' legal guardian in the raw weeks after the execution, while a permanent home was still being worked out.
He'd fought this case for 3 years, 5 trips to the Supreme Court, 2 personal pleas to the White House for clemency. He gave it everything he had left.
7 months after the execution, Emanuel Bloch was found dead in his apartment, a heart attack. He was 52.
The boys had already lost their parents. Within a year, they lost the one adult who'd fought hardest to keep that from happening, and who'd held them, briefly, in the gap between.
You may not know Abel Meeropol's name. You know his work. Under the pen name Lewis Allen, he wrote the song Strange Fruit, the anti-lynching song Billie Holiday made immortal.
A man who wrote 97 words about a government-tolerated killing spent the rest of his life raising the sons of two people he believed his own government had killed unjustly.
Michael and Robert took the Meeropol name. Robert Meeropol grew up to found the Rosenberg Fund for Children, supporting kids of targeted activists and political prisoners. And both brothers spent the rest of their lives trying to get their mother's name cleared.
Quick hits before we close.
The Meeropol brothers appealed to Presidents Obama and then Biden for a posthumous exoneration of Ethel. As of this recording, neither acted. The campaign hasn't stopped.
Morton Sobel, the third defendant convicted alongside them, served over 18 years, including time at Alcatraz, before finally admitting his own guilt in 2008.
David Greenglass died in 2014 at 92, having spent decades living under an assumed name in Queens.
And in a detail almost too on the nose for fiction, Judge Kaufman later became known for a career of otherwise liberal, civil liberties protective rulings. This case followed him for the rest of his life.
So, precision or instinct? Here's where I land. The evidence the government actually had on Ethel Rosenberg, at the moment they chose to prosecute her, was not evidence of a spy. It was a lever, and they used it until it killed her.
I won't argue, Julius. The Cables, Sobel, his own sons, that door's closed. But Ethel is a different file, and precision has to admit when the file is thin. A single VENONA mention with no code name, a typewriter story that surfaced 10 days before trial and was recanted decades later by the one man who told it. That's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a woman used as bait.
Two boys stood at the White House gates in 1953, asking a president to spare their parents. One of them stood there again in 2016, an old man now, asking a different president to admit the government got it wrong.
Nobody has yet. If you like tonight's case, the best thing you can do is follow the show. It costs nothing, and it means we get to keep doing this.
And leave a rating while you're there. It's the fastest way to help someone else find us.
I'm Eli Marchetti.
And Simone Valdez. Until next time.